Welcome to The Big L, your unofficial source for Libertarian Party news, arcana, and information for the liberty-minded political junkie. Find us at BigLPodcast.com. Here's your host, Libertarian Party insider and the pink flame of liberty, Caryn Ann.
It is a truth universally acknowledged that a podcaster, after promising more content, must be in want of a life. And this life shows up like an unwelcome ex to take over said podcaster's time. With all due apologies to Miss Austin, this is the position that I find myself in. So welcome back, mi guapes de libertad. It has been a crazy, crazy time. So here am I in sackcloth and ashes to give you an update of what is going on in my life with this podcast and to risk the furies by once again declaring my intention to get back on the podcasting wagon and give a hearty fuck you to the hoary gods of the realm of podfade. This episode will be a mix of highly personal update and oversharing, as typical, and reflections on the quote-unquote movement, as it were, and challenges that I often rant about that we face, at least how I see it. If oversharing makes you cringe, this probably would be a good time to depart, unless, of course, that is your kink. No judgment here.
YKINMKBYKIOK.
But then again, since that is my typical habit, I doubt very many of you have that particular aversion, or you would not be my typical audience.
Calling people daddy is gross. Stop kink shaming me. Kink shaming is my kink.
First, the personal update. As a rather long-winded way of explaining why I have not kept up with my goals of more regular content, and of course, my continued commitment to get back on that path, I've made no secret over the years that I have struggled mightily with some severe depressive episodes as well as a long-term diagnosis of OCD. My past includes a lengthy abusive marriage that had more long-lasting and profound effects than I had cared to realize. With one sole act of defiance on Labor Day weekend 2009, leading directly to where I am now, both personally and politically. The long and short of it involved, funny enough, a completely silly YouTube video of me dancing to the Rave Chicken song. To my Patreon subscribers, a link to this cluckalicious video will be included for subscribers only. So if that's not worth a few bucks a month, I do not know what will entice you. Life is funny. That my ex had absolutely forbid me to post as part of a very long-standing pattern of isolation and control. I do not know what got into me at that time, but all of a sudden I grew a backbone and said no. Not only was I going to post that, I was going to pursue several video projects I was interested in. And that one decision opened the floodgates to freedom. Yes, all of this background will become relevant. I was very isolated during that 20-year marriage, and I think this is something that a lot of people go through and don't realize that it is a hallmark of abuse. I was told who I could be friends with and was forbidden from confiding in any of those friends except for one approved friend. My fundamentalist beliefs at the time caused me to accept this behavior in arrangement, as the man was the boss and divorce was unthinkable and not an option. So all of this is to lay the backdrop that I was in self-protective mode for decades, purposely deadened to my own feelings and my own issues and my own needs, seeking always to please and keep the peace. Fast forward to today, and I could never imagine this current life of freedom. My present spouse is absolutely amazing, and we are free and equal partners. And finally, my guard was able to be let down, and critical self-examination and self-care was able to take place. Now, one would think at this point that life would just be a continual improvement, but such was not the case. And it seemed that all of a sudden, my personal relationships outside my marriage, and particularly in my job, it began to suffer. And the anxiety and stress levels that I kept bottled up so long took over. It was the floodgates opened to the extent that I basically had to max out my FMLA leave last year and really take a hard look at what was going on, at what was coming to the surface. And for those of you who follow me on my Facebook page, you know there was also the issue of finally being free to be able to try to figure out who my biological father was, and that is a mindfuck all of its own.
Who's your daddy? Come on, you know who your daddy is. Who's your daddy? Dargo, tell him who his daddy is.
I'm your daddy.
So when I finally got some answers, then they were the ones I had suspected for a bit, but only now had the luxury to consider and pursue, and I had the good fortune to have the right medical insurance to cover. I have found myself to be one of the lost female children of what was formerly known as Asperger's syndrome, which is now simply just part of the autism spectrum disorder.
You don't look autistic.
Fucking hell.
It's always men or children.
No,
It's
I agree, yeah.
Where's the girl?
I have let down autism. I am shit at maths, all right? Autistic people don't feel empathy.
Oh, fuck off.
With these answers, so much of my life has made sense. And in case you didn't know, what I was referring to before, it used to be thought, particularly during the time that I was growing up, that autism was something that primarily affected boys.
We have a great deal of difficulty identifying and diagnosing girls with autism without cognitive impairment. And there may be a male bias in our perception of autism. Girls with autism have been described as being better able to camouflage their symptoms of autism and to use compensatory behaviors that mask their social challenges.
And girls weren't really looked at. And there's a whole generation of lost girls that missed the help and support that they should have received, because girls present differently than boys. I'd like to say much differently in some ways than boys. And in some sense, obviously, there are some commonalities, but I'm one of those lost girls. Dealing with this diagnosis so late in life has been a rough time. There is a stigma. There definitely is a learning curve. And then there is the anger.
Shut up! Fuck off, you fat ass!
I mean, it's like as soon as I understood all these different things, you know, the face blindness and the auditory processing thing and the hyperlexia and, you know, all those other ancillary things that went with, with being on the spectrum, it was like somebody turned on the light and I just went, oh, that's what this is. That's why I react this way. That's why other people react this way to me. And I think after I was diagnosed, I really crashed. Because I had to go through this period where I felt like I wasted my life not knowing about this. I wasted what should have been the best years of my life, and now they're gone and I'll never get them back.
Anger at how things could have been so much different if I'd only known. But, que sera, sera. Now I had the tools to address potential shortcomings and improve my life, which was the main purpose in trying to get to the bottom of these difficulties I was having. I hope that explains a bit of my sporadicity. Is that a word? Well, it is a word now. And that I have earned your forbearance. Sorry to be so dramatic. And with this diagnosis, with this, you know, all of a sudden, this new label I'm saddled with, I had thought that I would face some hostility and prejudice, perhaps even disbelief from primarily my workplace, which had been the source of a great deal of my stress and where relationships had already been quite rocky. But to my pleasant surprise, no, they have been supportive. And equally surprising and conversely unpleasant is the completely douchey way that this disclosure has been treated and received by some in my libertarian family. The last place in the world that I thought would harbor ableist bigotry. But it's there and it's real and it's ugly. And it runs from your typical social media troll soy boy trying to be a big man to your state affiliate board of directors to even fellow LNC members. This has been the worst part of all. Really, it's put me into a bit of a tailspin and self-reflection as to whether this is even a movement that is worth being involved with.
That's true. It's true. That's true. It's true. That's true.
Now, since I am still here, obviously I've come to the conclusion that it is, but this has not been a particularly happy time, and it has continued a longstanding resolve that I had that we are, as a community, definitely in need of some self-reflection and improvement. Let me give you an example of one of the wonderful experiences I've had since being pretty open, as I always am, about what's going on in my life. One particularly unpleasant individual speculated that I must have doctor shopped and lied, because just needed to get that sweet, sweet autism diagnosis. That is the grand prize, isn't it? We all want that, and I schemed to get it. What kind of obscenely nasty and mental person does one have to be to make a statement like that? And the fact that it was witnessed by so many, and few could even be bothered to comment that, hey, man, that's pretty fucked up, or even socially censure such an attitude.
Dude, we party too hard, so now our bodies are in terrible shape. So we gotta trick the doctor by making it seem like we're in really good shape. And there's only one way to do that. Bleach.
Today, we're gonna be asking, is this YouTuber faking autism?
One of the biggest battles that I fight is other people's perception of me. Being late diagnosed, I held myself to the standard of being normal or neurotypical, and other people did the same. When people suppose that I don't have autism because I don't seem autistic or look autistic, it feels like an accusation that I'm a liar for whatever reason, that it would somehow gain me something. And also a denial of the person and existence that throughout my life I've constantly tried to hide. Even though my kind of autism is pretty much invisible to you, it still is a very deep part of who I am. I could tell you about the meltdowns, the stims, the overwhelm, but honestly, I don't owe anyone an explanation for being who I am. It's okay if you don't believe me. In your world, people have bad motives all the time. In my world, it doesn't really make sense for someone to pretend to have something so stigmatized. To you, it could be a ploy for sympathy. But to me, it's just an answer to a question that I didn't even know I had been asking.
So that is the lead up to the substantive and non-story time part of this episode. Welcome to the Libertarian Thunderdome. Our ideas can terrify others. Why? Because there are vulnerable people in the world, and survival of the fittest is attractive only to sociopaths. And the world does not see how such vulnerable people would receive protection or care in Libertopia. But who will build the roads is actually, but who will make sure old people are not dying in the streets? And the typical libertarian response does not really touch upon the actual question, though it pretends to do so. For instance, here is Larkin Rose on the roads question. And I am not using this to diss Larkin. Love Larkin. He's a, great ambassador for, the audience that he particularly appeals to, which is not generally the circles I run in, since he thinks, voting is violence and all of that. All I'm just saying, this isn't meant to throw any shade upon Larkin. This was just a good example of something I see all of us doing.
Let's apply the same argument to food, because food is pretty darn important. I think everybody can agree. Let's apply the same argument that statists use about the roads or caring for the poor or protection or anything like that. The argument would go like this. Now, in the context of food, listen how idiotic this is. If we don't have government demanding money from all of us under the threat of caging us, and that's what taxation is. Here's the money you have to give us. Here's the nasty things we do to you if you don't. If that didn't happen so that they could build a big food production and distribution system and feed us, well, we'd all starve. We'd all just sit around saying, gosh, I wish we had food, but, no politicians and tax collectors. We're just going to sit around and starve to death. Now, in this country, nobody would believe something that stupid because all you have to do is go to a supermarket and see a perfect example of really efficient, organized cooperation that nobody is forced to do. There is no, if you're going to make the argument that people make about roads and protection and all that, you'd say, well, nobody is forced to make any food for anybody in this country. How do you know everyone's just going to say, well, it's not my job? And we'll all starve to death. There's no guarantee. There's no master plan guaranteeing that we'll all have food. So obviously we're all going to starve if we don't have an authoritarian government stealing our money and then making food and giving it to us. Because golly gee, we couldn't possibly do it voluntarily ourselves. Again, in this country, nobody makes that argument because they see it happening voluntarily. Nobody involved is forced to do that. Nobody is forced to make you a single bite of food. There is no guarantee at all from anybody. And yet, Americans are, by and large, hugely overweight. Obviously, we don't have a lack of food. And one of the most common things is, who will build the roads? Which is amazingly stupid to me. Just amazingly stupid. And when people say, well, who will build the roads? The first answer is the same damn people who do it now. Politicians and tax collectors don't build the friggin' roads. Have you ever seen one out there? No, you haven't. They steal our money, waste most of it, do all their corrupt games, and then they pay other people. Here's an idea. How about if we pay those other people who actually build the stinking road? And the fact that that doesn't occur to people is a great indication of how well indoctrinated people are by the rulers who will perpetually tell us, you can't organize anything, you can't achieve anything, you can't do anything unless we are here to force it on you.
He recognizes that the infamous roads question also involves things like feeding the poor, because the non-libertarian is bundling these issues, perhaps even mistakenly classing them together. But that is a mistake we cannot make, but which Larkin does make here. He answers the questions about the roads with the analogy to, but who will make the food? And then considers the question about roads and the poor answered on both counts. And as to the who it is, well, it will be the same people who are doing it now, us. But while the roads question might really be about who, the question on charity isn't only about who, but about why. It is obvious why compulsion is not needed for supermarkets to exist. There is a market for it, and those providing those services profit from it. A market is not the same thing as a need, however, and the poor and elderly have needs. So why would these be provided for voluntarily? And would they really be provided for voluntarily in an effective manner? And the reality is that there is no chance that without the government, things like food and shelter would be, not available for sale. That's going to happen. It's something we all need, something we all want, and it's such a commonality. We all get something out of it. But there is a chance that charity would not be provided unless libertarian dystopia is simply not possible. And the fact is, it is.
Welcome to Thunderdome, bitch.
And while those of us of a hard deontological bent can say all of that still does not justify aggression, That is a hard sell. And the audience may not even consider forced charity aggression a topic for another episode. For those folks, we must assert believably that charity can exist with mob rule, which is how they see it, that left to our own devices, safety nets, as good as or better than the state provides, would arise. We must demonstrate the good of voluntary communities. And I submit that oftentimes we suck at doing that. Not just, but equally, the reaction cannot be glorifying such behavior or being aesthetically neutral about the bad use of rights or denying that there is a bad use of rights at all. And with a bit more maturity, I see that probably is the heart of what Tucker was getting at. Aesthetic focus. Denying cultural nihilism as long as no aggression is involved. Recognizing that a lack of aggression is a sufficient condition for a deontologically just society. But it is only a necessary, not a sufficient one for a flourishing society. That society fundamentally needs more than bare justice. It needs humanity. It needs beauty. In short, it needs aesthetics. That piece still irritates me a bit, but not nearly as much. I still think he coyly flirts with denying principles. But I think the overarching point of recognizing the right to both love and hate should not be treated with a false equivalence and reductionism. And you noted correctly that a brutalist outworking of our ideology is exemplified by the libertarian Thunderdome run amok that we see on our dysfunctional social media places.
We all believe in the non-aggression axiom and no other content to that. Like anything that's non-aggressive is permitted, and we don't, try to script how that looks in the social order. And that's the beauty and wonder of the libertarian perspective. And yet, I had began to look into this architectural school called brutalism that was like radically fundamentalist in the sense that it came up with an ethical and aesthetic opposition to any kind of elaborations on pure function of a building. And I think that the non-aggression principle, its merit is that it has no other content beyond that. On the other hand, it enables, for example, a person to have malicious views towards his fellows, to desire to cast people down, to call on very wicked things to happen to others, to be filled with hatred and still not violate the NIP, right? So my purpose in writing this article was to say, the spirit of liberty as it has emerged over the last 1,000 years is not really about any of those things that nonetheless were permitted, but really is about a kind of a growing social awareness of the dignity of every individual person. It's about individualism. It's not about tribalism. It's certainly not about hate. It's about love and trade and association and prosperity and the flourishing of humanity. I mean, that's what I was calling humanitarianism. And to me, these are the themes that make liberty really beautiful. And I don't think as libertarians we should be shy at all about talking about those kinds of things, We don't have to be neutral with regard to what kind of society we want to live in, actually. I mean, is it a society of malice and hate and casting people down, or is it a society of lifting up, of spreading prosperity and spreading human dignity? So that's what the article was about. I wasn't attempting to say you're a libertarian, you're not. The article was against libertarian brutalism. I'm acknowledging the libertarianism of the brutalist idea. What's funny to me, I know we're out of time, but what's funny to me is that, in writing that article, it was a thought process for me, very much of a kind of a study of an application of an architectural analogy. I gave the really cool name to the people that I was discouraging. And I gave the sort of slightly lame, wimpy name to the people I was praising.
That is the most metal thing I ever heard in my whole life.
We don't police our own, and that's a fact. And until we can learn to run our own communities and libertarian spaces, we have little business telling others how they should run theirs. We're just not ready yet as a species. That the great leap in moral and social evolution has not yet taken place, but we are certainly on the precipice. And this requires moving from theory into practice, from ideology into praxology. Right now, simply, we are children. We are children playing at anarchy on another's dime. We know it isn't real, and thus we don't really have to face the actual personal responsibility that is entailed. And we just bask in the immature freedom. And it reminds me, again, as I am wont to do with my biblical analogies, of something that the Apostle Paul had said. And I think it's apropos to us here in our own little. He had said, when I was a child, I spoke as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see in a mirror darkly, but then face to face. Are we ready to put away childish things? That is when libertarianism shall succeed, when we see that we can be stalwart individualists and still recognize that we are indeed our brother's keeper. All right, that is it for now. I'm working on the next episode as we speak. I've got all kinds of things to go over with you. We need to continue in the series that I was working on before on the libertarian fundamentals, that I was using the Radical Caucus key principles as a springboard to discuss. And also, we just had an LNC meeting and there was some hot drama.
This is great. This is some good drama. You can't pay for that. No, you can't. It just simply is. It's like an eclipse or something. Yeah. You gotta be there. You gotta be there.
And I'd like to go over that with you a bit. So until then, you have an awesome day or night or whatever it might be in your little part of Libertopia, and see you next time. Mi guapas de libertad.
Thank you for listening to The Big L, where size does matter. Subscribe today and help support the show by going to BigLPodcast.com. This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.